Good evening and welcome to the Institute for Human Sciences. My name is Ivan Vejvoda. I'm a permanent fellow here and leading a project called Europe's Futures. And it gives me great pleasure and honor to introduce our two speakers on behalf of Professor Shalini Randeira, who unfortunately is not able to be with us here tonight. This is our regular series, the Political Salon, that Christian Ultsch, who is the editor, the foreign editor of the Presse here in Vienna, and along with that, also the author of a book recently published, Flucht, that looks at the, to put it very simply, the inside story of the whole migration crisis, not only in Austria, but in broader terms. But we are here tonight also and primarily because of my colleague and friend Ivan Krastev's recently published book, After Europe, translated in several languages, and that is quite a hit, and published by the University of Pennsylvania. Christian and Ivan will lead a discussion. Ivan will speak first. But I've been asked by my colleagues to say that those of you who are not yet registered or would like to apply for the information that we send out regularly on our events can do so in the entree here of the Institute. So without further ado, please welcome our guests. And of course, after their discussion, we will have a question and answer. So Christian, thanks again for being with us.
First, thank you very much for coming. And everybody who has written a book knows something. The first 2 or 3 discussions of the book that you have are very exciting. And then basically I know why people are writing a next book. Because they want to stop to talk about the previous one. Because you have the feeling that you're repeating yourself all the time. And this is the case. So this is why we decided basically to organize it much more as a conversation than a presentation, because some of the colleagues, particularly in the Institute, have been hearing some of the argument. So what we decided to do is the following. Just in 10 minutes, I'm going to give you the major argument. So I'm not going to give you any details and so on, why the book was written, and then we can go into discussion. I'll do this because this is a small book. It is not an academic book. It tries to make an argument and basically was very much a reaction to certain developments and certain questions that I see coming. And this was basically based on 2 major intuitions with which I'll start. The first is when I have been seeing all this process of crisis of the European Union, I suddenly discovered that there is one major difference in the reaction of East Europeans and West Europeans which cannot be reduced simply to different political culture, institutions, and others, but had a lot of much more sources in the different personal experiences of the people living. And it goes like this. East Europeans, nevertheless where they stand politically, have seen the collapse of the major political system in their lifetime. Communism collapse, Soviet Union, Yugoslavia. As a result of it, if we're experts on something, we're experts on fragility. We believe that things are very fragile, every political project. So nevertheless, that I don't know many East Europeans who are going to compare European Union to a Soviet Union. This is a very kind of a tiny group of people who use it mainly for political argument. They're always going to be certain unconscious level of strange comparisons. And nevertheless, it's a comparisons between apples and cherries. People always have these comparisons, nevertheless of what they're telling you. They always have the feeling that they have seen this before. The second story is that in most of the West European crises, basically the crisis of the Union was very much discussed basically in the terms of Eurozone crisis and Euro crisis being perceived as the shaping phenomena. And this has a lot to do, of course, of the fact that the Euro crisis came first, because to a certain extent it was very much discussed there. But my argument in the book is that migration crisis is going to have a much more profound impact on the political developments of the European Union and the different nation states. But when I talk about migration crisis, it has not much to do with the number of the people that came to Europe in 1915 and 16. Because here is the paradox. The impact of the migration crisis on the voters' behavior happened to be stronger in the countries in which you do not have migrants. And this is very important. Listen, if we talk pure numbers, the numbers look like this. 0.5% of the population of the European Union represents the number of the people who came 2015, 2016. Just to have an impression of comparison, the number of the refugees from the Syrian war who are now in Jordan is around 32% of the population of the country. So from time to time when people start talking, they should have a perspective what they talk about. It does not mean that this is not going to have a profound crisis. And this is why I always make the comparisons with the 9/11 on the American perception of the world. Listen, 3,000 people being killed in New York is a tragedy, but in terms of numbers, this is not the worst thing that has happened in the world. There are people being killed all the time. But it forced Americans to see the world differently. It profoundly changed the nature of the American politics, and we can discuss many things about what is happening in the United States, but nobody is going to understand certain developments if he's not going to see how 9/11 changed the perception of globalization and the American role in the world and so on. Something like this happened also with migration. And from there, basically for me, in the book, migration is not so much the people coming to Europe. It's a migration of votes, particularly the blue-collar votes from the center-left to the far-right. People who are here in Austria and who know basically the results, particularly of the second and the third round of the presidential elections, knows to what extent basically the blue-collar vote, which traditionally was perceived as support for the social democratic parties all over Europe, have moved to the far-right. And this is not an Austrian phenomenon. It's almost everywhere there. Secondly, I do believe that we are talking about a migration of identities and arguments. For example, it was very typical in the 1970s to hear some of the radical people on the left saying, you cannot impose, for example, development on Indian rural communities because people have the right to preserve their way of life. And now the same argument, we have the right to preserve our way of life, is coming from the middle class communities in the West. So this type of a change, in my view, is also quite important. And the last thing that I was trying to make is that from this point of view, it's not enough to talk about the change simply in the terms of rise of populism. I'm not going to go on the discussion of populism, and our friend and colleague Jan Werner Müller, who is here, wrote a very interesting book about this. But in conceptual terms, populism is slightly like the shoe of Cinderella. I mean, this is a social theory in terms basically of an actor which is going to fit it. Because first, populism in Europe is in plural. There are many differences between the populist parties, and it's very much, to be honest, many of the parties which are called as extreme in the West European political systems, from where I come, are going to be perceived as centrists on the list of gender and so on. But the real question is not so much about where these people come from, what is their program, and so on. Nevertheless, I'll be very happy to discuss this when it comes. I do believe we see a major transformation of the political system. We had a similar transformation, in my view, in the 1960s, late 60s and 70s. And don't forget that then the word populism was brought back. And it was in 1967 when basically Gellner and Gita Ionescu has this first big book on populism. But I do believe now, of course, the situation is that the mainstream parties are much worse organized. And while in the 1970s, there was a problem of de-radicalization, for example, of the challenge then coming much more from the left, it's not very clear how the institutions are going to react now. So I'm going to end up with my kind of a last argument in the book, and this was that I'm not so much afraid of the ideology of many of the populist parties, because unlike 1930s, their ideologies is much more modest, let's put it like this. What populists are giving to people is not so much a different view of the future, but it's a 3D experience of politics. I don't know how many of you have gone to the 3D cinemas, It works very well when you have special effects movies, but it is not that you're going to get better the story or better the character, but you have the feeling that you're in, that you're part of the movie. And this is what many of these people are doing. People continue to be spectators, but they're spectators who believe that they're part of the game. But saying this, I do believe one of the most dangerous elements which I see and which is going to have major implications for the future development of the EU is the proliferation of the referendums all over the European Union. And I'm not talking about in and out referendums like Brexit. By the way, I find this very disappointing how it happened, but it's a legitimate referendum. People should have their vote on this. But we are going to have what is happening everywhere. And I know that here in the coalition agreement between the Freedom Party and the Conservative Party, you also have this. Everybody, in order to convince the people that they care about their vote and their voice, basically mainstream political parties, not only populist parties, are trying to make it very easy for people to create referendum initiatives, believing that this kind of a shift to direct democracy is going to give much more legitimacy. So where is my problem? I'm not a great fan of referendums, but I'm also not very scary of them. I know the theory of a political scientist from the 1950s who said, when the sovereign speaks, he knows only two words, yes and no. Well, this is fine. But what works on the national level is not going to work on the European level. My major argument is European Union cannot survive as the union of referendums because the referendums cannot talk to each other. They cannot negotiate. This is the final statement of the political community. And from this point of view, we can end up with this type of a referendum wave where national voters in different member states are going to block common policies, and as a result of it, European Union is going to look dysfunctional. And this is what basically worries me. So this is in the book what I'm claiming, that if European Union decides to commit a suicide, referendum is going to be the weapon of choice. I should stop here and go to Christian.
I've read your book twice, once in English.
I knew that somebody has read it.
And one in German as well. And it's really, I guess most of you have read it. It's really some sort of a treasure chest for witty thoughts and aphorisms and very dense analysis. So it's really, I can really highly recommend it to you. But I wondered whether you have chosen because I couldn't detect any question mark on the title.
Can I answer immediately on this, because it's a factual. I had a beautiful title, but it can run only in Vienna. The original title with which I went to the publishing house was Perhaps Book.
Perhaps a book?
Yeah.
Okay, well, we don't say we wouldn't have sold any book.
Exactly. This is what they told me. So this was.
But at one point, you write that you believe that the train of disintegration has already left Brussels. So there's problem with the microphone. And well, this is some sort of a Nostradamus moment in this book. And I thought what I wanted to ask you and explain to us, why do you believe that the European Union could fall apart at this moment?
This is important. My major argument is I don't believe that European Union is going to fall apart going back to the nation states in the way they were. And one of the most important things that we learned from this crisis is if there are going to be a major collapse of the European Union, it is going to result in the disintegration of some of the member states. And from this point of view, Catalonia was a great example. The fact that you simply can go back, this option is not in the cards. But I do believe that European Union has been changed and is going to be changed. So the European Union in the way we know it, and this is not there anymore. We should also try to be sure that we continue to see it in the way it was, but it is not there anymore. ESI recently had a paper in which they have a very beautiful story in the beginning, which I'm going to steal from them. And the story is the following. One specialist on wine invited 57 leading experts on wine, and he gave them one red wine and one white wine to comment on the qualities. The only problem is that the red wine was a white wine, but they simply had this type of color which does not influence the taste at all. And of course, everybody who has been commenting on the red wines was commenting as if it is a red wine. They're giving all the characteristics and so on and so on. This is what I do believe has happened with the European Union. I don't believe that we are in the hypothesis, first, of ever close union as taken for granted. I do believe that there are going to be a major changes in the way basically member states but also citizens understand the process of European integration. If there was a teleology behind it, this teleology is not there anymore. This is an open discussion what kind of a union, and strangely enough from different countries and different social groups and political parties, you're going to have different answers. Till now, the trick of the European Union was based on two things. First, we never talk about disintegration. Don't forget, we don't know what is disintegration of the European Union. How many countries should leave for us to claim that there is disintegration? If, for example, European Union is going to be populated by authoritarian governments, do we believe this is the same European Union? What is the meaning of disintegration? On one level. And on the other, the trick was that we are not talking disintegration because making it unthinkable, but the other, we talk as if we agree on how the European Union is going to look like in the future. Yeah, we know that there are federalists and there are others and so on, but you never had an explicit discussion about the difference. And this was very important. I do believe this was a very smart political move, but this smart political move kind of exhausted its usability exactly because of the crisis and because of the changes in the national politics.
But isn't there still a tendency to close the eyes and still go on? I mean, there is no discussion, in fact, about disintegration. On the contrary, I mean, there are attempts by the French president Macron to deepen the integration inside the European Union, and he just seems to wait. The groom seems to wait for the German bride to go ahead with integration, be it in defense policy or be it in financial policy. So.
I do believe it's slightly more complicated. I could be totally wrong. Most of the time I am. But the problem with Macron is, on one level, why Macron was so important. He was the first major politician in Europe who managed to combine anti-establishment sentiment with the pro-European sentiment. This is what made him difficult. By the way, his effect on the French party system is not much different than the effect of the French party system of a populist party. Basically, he destroyed the French political parties, mainstream parties, but he was the first one who said to be anti-establishment does not need that you should be anti-European. And this is a very important change. But then...
Do you see anybody who could repeat this trick?
But I can, and I'm going to give you an example on this, but the interesting story with Macron is that when he started talking about this kind of a much more integrated, consolidated European Union, he's not talking about the borders. He's never saying that it should be the European Union as a whole. So from this point of view, we are back in the 1991-1992, where the two parties, the widening party and the deepening party, have been arguing with each other. And I do believe, honestly, and I hope I am wrong, that when Mr. Macron talks about European Union, he has in mind the Eurozone. For him, it's very much basically consolidation and integration of the Eurozone, which also means that you're going to make a periphery out of the non-Eurozone countries, which basically is mostly Central Eastern Europe and Scandinavia. So from this point of view, it's very different than what you're going to hear in Brussels or even in the Juncker speeches and so on, because before the idea of the federalization was not federalizing the core and having a periphery. The idea was that you are basically federalizing everything. And from this point of view, it's quite interesting. I'm just going to give you one example about Macron, which I found important. Listen, Macron speaks Europe very much. And I have a huge respect also for his rhetorical talent, but he speaks Europe to the French voters. There was this famous initiative with which he came. To be honest, from economic point of view, this is much less important than he believes. The economy showed that 1% of the population is basically, 1% of the population have been touched by this. And this is so-called poster directive. For those who are not doing this, it means that now when a Bulgarian truck driver drives through France, he gets much lower salary than the minimum wage in France, which makes him much more competitive. Okay. And Mr. Macron decided to change this. He could have done it in two different ways. One is going to East Europeans and said, guys, this is a scandal that you have such low salaries. Your model of lower salaries and low taxes is not going to work because this model of low taxes and low salaries explain the major exodus of people from your countries. So I'm here to try to correct this, and as a result of it, basically I'm asking that no way you're going to have less than the minimum wage. And then he's going to have a constituency in Central and Eastern Europe. I want to see any Central and East European government telling to their voters, your salaries are fine. He didn't say this. He said, I want to do this because I want to make it easier for the French workers.
But isn't it interesting as well that he tried to split? Maybe this was only a side effect, but basically he managed to convince the Czech Prime Minister, who was a social democrat back then, and the Slovak Prime Minister, Robert Fico. But, well, he still did not try to convince the Polish or the Hungarian prime ministers. So, which brings me to a question: do you think that this was some sort of a strategy? On the other hand, doesn't this show that the Visegrad group isn't as unified as it seemed during the migration crisis?
Visegrad group is unified only on the migration issue. And basically on many other issues, it's very much divided because it's also very different economies and very different political regimes. And this is when people talk about populism. Populism is like gardening and cooking. It's very local one. These parties has a very different political profiles. It's not even that the Czech Republic is different than others, which is obvious. Poland and Hungary are very different. Poland is very much, you have a much more ideological. Mr. Kaczynski, like Mr. Corbyn in the UK, never changed his views. What he's saying now, he was saying always. There was a very strong kind of a conservative, sovereignist strength in the Polish politics, and he was very much there. So he was totally non-opportunistic. Mr. Orban, who is a very gifted politician otherwise, he has been changing his views and much more trying to smell what is in the air than basically starting on a very much of ideological position. The social base to which they go is very different. But look at the three other issues on which they are so different. One is Russia. Listen, tell me what is common between Orban's pro-Russia policy and Poland's idea, and basically Mr. Kaczynski believes that Russian president killed his brother. So on this, not easy. In their relations to Germany, they are very different. Because Germany is very strong present in the economy of all four countries, but while in Poland and Hungary you have quite strong anti-German sentiments, you don't have this in the Czech Republic or Slovakia at all. So from this, and the third thing which is very interesting in my view, and this is something that I should have basically also pointed out when I was presenting the book, because this is probably one of the things that you have more rarely heard about the migration. Go to the German elections. I'm going to give you a German example. The strongest predicator for who is voting for Alternative for Germany are not the regions in which the highest number of refugees came, but the regions from which the highest number of people has left for the last 25 years. It's very much the trauma of emigration. And this is very much East European issue. Because if you're going to see why countries like Bulgaria, with 1,000 people and others, became so much hostile and so on, in my view, you should keep in mind that some important change has happened in the perception of the people in the last 2 or 3 years. If 5 years ago, the fact that we can work abroad, immigrate, and so on was perceived basically as positive. Now, for people who are staying in this country, they more and more start to perceive it as negative. They have the feeling that they are losing some of the more energetic part of the population, that this is making these societies non-competitive. And also what is becoming critically important, for the first time I'm hearing in our country the following argument. We are subsidizing countries like Germany and Austria. We are investing in the education of all these people who are going to go and to work there. So yes, there are transfers of money from the west to the east, but there is also transfer of money from this point of view to the east to the west. And to imagine how strong this is becoming is, do you know that in Norway there is no any education for doctors? They don't have any university that educates doctors. All the doctors in Norway are import. And a huge of them, as you can imagine, are import from Central and Eastern Europe. So from this point of view, this is new. Listen, they're different countries. Czech Republic, for example, has a much lower level of immigration. And keep in mind, there is no direct correlation between economic performance and the number of people who are living. The Baltic republics, which have been quite successful in their economic performance, in the last 10 years, more than 10% of the population has left. And listen, we're talking about societies of, in the Baltics, 2 million. In the case of Bulgaria, 8 million. This is not only about percentage. In a certain way, you don't have so many, particularly in the aging society. So I do believe that impact and the changing perception of the emigration is one of the things that very much explains also this kind of a xenophobic closing of East European societies. And this is something that people don't talk much about. In the Czech Republic, for example, the percent of people living is much lower. And also, these countries are very different. Do you know that the Czech Republic is the most secular place in Europe? 70% of the Czechs declare themselves as secular. Poland is one of the most religious places in Europe.
Ivan, let me come back to the point you made in your introduction. Why do you think that the migration crisis has such a power, even more power than the financial crisis, than the Brexit with all its consequences, to really change the European Union? I'm asking because I think that at the moment the European Union seems to have to come to grips more or less with the migration crisis by simply outsourcing the problem to gatekeepers in Turkey and in Libya. They're paying them to hold illegal migrants off. So to me it seems it's more or less solved. Nevertheless, politicians like Mr. Orban, for instance, he's still trying to instrumentalize it and seems to be grateful by every criticism that comes from Brussels, by every criticism of Hungary and Poland still denying the quotas. But don't you think that it's more or less done?
Okay, let's see on what level it is handled and in what level it is not. The level in which what was handled, and it was very important during the 2015-2016, many people in Europe had the feeling that situation is out of control. You see, you go on the television set, you hear all these people moving, you don't know who they are, where they're coming, and even people who are otherwise very supportive and sympathetic to the plight of these people said, do we know what is happening? Do our governments know what is happening? So the fact that situation is not under control was one of the major sources. And democratic governments cannot allow people to believe the situation is not under control, because then the very foundations of democracy is under question. Chancellor Merkel, we can like or dislike the Turkish deal, managed to show something important. No, we are in control. I can open the border, I can close the border. And I do believe this was the reason why.
It took some time.
It took some time, but this is why people basically said she can do it. And I do believe part of the support, because many of the Central Europeans, to be honest, I do believe that Mr. Orban betted that Merkel cannot be elected anymore. This is where Central Europeans are reading West Europeans wrongly. They always believe, everybody believes that the others are like us. And he said, you cannot survive this type of a crisis. But from this point of view, we go to why migration is handled on this level, but you cannot believe that it is handled on other level. Because migration, for many Europeans, become the new view of the world which they saw after 2015, 2016. Listen, what we understand is, in my view, three simple things. Europe is not at the center of the world anymore. Basically, in the next decades, the population of Europe is going to be 7% of the population of the world. Our GDP is going to decline, not because we're doing bad, but because others are not doing bad. But thirdly, also what people understood is that in a world of global comparisons, in which people can move much more, and in a world which is much more individualistic in its values, if you want to change your life and if you're living in a badly governed and a poor place, better change your country than to try to change your government. This is what basically we learned, and I do believe this is something which is not handled. And people never underestimate the intelligence of the ordinary people when they basically try to imagine the future. Why migration became so important? Because unlike any other crisis, migration put at the center of the European debate the problem of borders. Let's give you one example. When 1989, in the national interest issue, Francis Fukuyama wrote his famous essay. I'm talking about the essay, not about the book, The End of History. And this is, by the way, much more intelligent piece than people normally believe. This is not a cartoon. He has captured some important things happening in the world. He was talking a lot about the free movement of ideas, the free movements of capital, the free movements of good. The only thing that was not moving was people. The word migration is absent from the article. When he was trying to imagine the future globalization, everything was moving, only people were staying at home. And it makes sense if your home is Chicago. But basically, if you're coming from other parts of the world, this is not the best thing that you can do with yourself. And I do believe from this point of view, the borders came, and here comes the borders in three important. I'm answering slightly longer because for me this is critical to understand why I do believe migration is so important. Listen, after the World War I, major catastrophe, the idea was empires should collapse, and we are going to redraw the borders in order to create a much more cohesive and legitimate state units. And this is how the post-imperial nation states come in this part of the world. After World War II, the idea was we should not too much redraw the borders, but we're going to exchange the population. We're going to create ethnically more homogeneous places, and Central and Eastern Europe is the incarnation of this, in which basically legitimacy to a certain extent is going to come from ethnic homogeneity. In 1939, 1/3 of the population of Poland was non-Poles. During the communist period, more than 95% have been Poles. Not to blame Poles for this, by the way, they have not been expelling anybody. And certainly came 1989, and the idea was we're not going to remove borders, and we're not going forcefully to exchange people, but we're going to create the borders that in a certain way don't matter. Soft borders and hard budgets. This was the philosophy of the European Union back then. This cannot stand anymore. First, where is the out border of the EU? Comes the first story. We're going to basically defend our outer borders. Where is the outer border of the EU? For example, to what extent countries like Macedonia, who is not a member of the EU, or Albania, we should treat them as part of the outer border or not? Is the borders of European Union the border of Schengen? Bulgaria is not part of Schengen. Should you defend European Union on the Bulgarian border or on the Hungarian border? Then if you're going to reconsider totally the nature of the border between European Union and the outside world, how this is going to affect the relations between the internal border between the member states, particularly if you're going to imagine that they're going to be diversified European Union with somebody is going to be part of this, part of that. So I do believe that European Union is based on neglecting the border question, trying to see we are going to talk about the future, not talking about borders. Migration crisis come and said, let's talk borders again. Not necessarily redrawing borders, but let's talk borders again.
Couldn't this be helpful in trying to define the European identity by defining its borders?
Everything is helpful in the world. This is what my grandmother has taught me. The only problem is this is why I do believe that we are moving to a different European Union. This is when you talk about the trade. I do believe that this, you cannot ignore this anymore. We're going to talk about the borders. It's going to be practical questions, how people are going to cross this border coming, how the people are going cross this border going. This is very much also about sovereignty, because one of the things is not only people, but also information crosses border. It's not by accident that counterintelligence agencies are the most difficult to cooperate. Because in a certain way, the border points are the points in which you gather information. And with whom you share this information is critically important. For example, one of the things that those of you who basically follow these conversations know very well you're going to basically get an information from, for example, French counterintelligence saying, oh, there is a guy whom we're interested because he's a trafficker of children. And then you start going and you realize that he's much more terrorist, but they don't want to do it because they're afraid that you'll try to do it your way and you can destroy their plan for penetration and so on. So from this point of view, the problem of border is the problem of political community. Who belongs and who does not belong. And the problem how we are going to define political community is the European crisis put us as the question, let's define European political community as Europeans. But you have renationalization of sentiments, because it's not by accident. Then the major political process in many of the countries, and here Hungary and Poland comes very clear, is democratic majoritarianism. It's a totally different understanding of the nature of the majority. The majority is not simply a coalition of minorities. The majority is the nation. And who is out of the majority in a certain way is out of the nation, and this is a major change also based on the fact that borders came as a major issue in European debate.
Ivan, do you believe that you describe this phenomenon of illiberal, the rise of illiberal populists, rise of the meaning of illiberal democracies? He quotes Orban saying, democracy can also be illiberal.
Yeah.
To which degree do you think that this is just a fleeting moment in history, this comeback of illiberals? What makes you so sure that it is here to stay? And do you believe that this is really a challenge for the substance of the European Union? In other words, can a European Union exist with illiberal governments being part of the system, and for how long can this go on and without any problems?
I'll start with the fact that European Union is an ideological project. It's not simply the combination of countries. It's not an intergovernmental organization which is based on no ideology at all. You can like or dislike this ideology, but if you're going to change basically the ideology of the member state, you're going to change the union, obviously. What is interesting, I do believe Mr. Orban is a highly articulate person, and reading his speeches, because this year, so almost every year in July, he's giving a speech. Normally he's doing this in Romania. It's a very important speeches. I mean, it's not simply to disagree, he's making a very strong claims. And one of them is, the last one he did was the following. He said, 25 years ago, when the Berlin Wall was down, we believed that Europe is the future that we should imitate. Now we do believe that we are the future, Hungary, that others should imitate. I don't believe that this is exactly the case, and I do believe that one of the things that he cannot understand is to what extent both the social, cultural, demographic nature of the Hungarian society is very different than Europe. But what he's trying to make is that in this moment, basically consolidation should happen on the level of the nation state. And what they're creating is very much majoritarian regimes, which are very much characterized by the fact that you're trying to weaken and destroy any constraints on the executive power. Why this is important, and by the way, this is not the result of the migration crisis. Migration crisis consolidated it, but it is basically, in my view, and I could be wrong, but it, in my view, is rooted in something much more important. This is kind of the profound ambiguity of the liberalism when it comes to 1989. 1989 was a revolution in which not simply that you don't have a violence, but you're integrating your opponents, you're integrating the old elites, you're not trying to destroy them. Because it was a kind of a revolution, was very much keeping in mind what happened when the communists came or the French Revolution happened and so on. As a result of it, in the liberal democracy, the good news is that when you're losing, you're not losing much. The bad news is that when you're winning, you're not winning much. And when people like Mr. Kaczynski came, his message was, how do we know that we have won in 1989 when the same people that have been governing before and living better now? This is a stolen revolution. The only thing that can legitimize a revolution is the destruction, not simply of institutions, but a former governing class. So from this point of view, he goes to a much older tradition of a revolution. And as a result of it, he said, what is a separation of powers? Separation of powers is an alibi for the elites not to deliver to the people what people voted on elections. Because you voted for somebody and he said, okay, but I cannot do it because of the central bank. I cannot do it because of the constitutional court. So why people, and this, for me, this was a very important question, why Central and East Europeans who had an experience with authoritarian power and who know very well that if you're not going to give a lot of power to somebody, don't be sure that he's going to return the power back to you. Why they were ready to do this? And in my view, Kaczynski had a very important term called impossibilism. Very important term. He said you have the elites which are all the time telling you that nothing is possible, everything is impossible. You have governments that are competing in political party who is more impotent than others. They're all the time trying to tell you what they cannot do. I'm here to make a change, but give me enough power. Give me all power. If you're not going to give me all power, you cannot keep me accountable. So paradoxically, people are giving this power believing that this is the way to have the powers accountable. This is part of the voters' frustration. And I do believe this is very important to understand why, in the views of many of the people voting for this party, this is not anti-democratic vote. They wanted to try their vote matter. This is why I do believe that what you're asking about illiberal democracies, no. If you're going to have Europe populated by majoritarian regimes, these regimes has a totally different way of functioning with other countries. They are sovereignists by definition. They cannot know how to share sovereignty. And from this point of view, if it's only Hungary and Poland, if it's a small countries, it's not going to work. But imagine for a moment in which every of the EU member states has said, Germany first, Poland first, Hungary first. Union cannot go like this.
You say that this breakdown of liberal democracies can only be seen right now at the periphery of Europe. I found that interesting. But what if liberal democracy breaks down at the center of Europe? Do you think that this is possible? Looking back maybe at this year, 2017, with the elections in France, in Netherlands, in Germany, where in the end right-wing populists didn't win.
No, listen, I want to start with something, because it's very important for my understanding of politics. When people say, can something be possible, I start from the assumptions that everything is possible. And this is not simply the Bulgarian in me. There is a Bulgarian peasant in me which very much believes that everything is possible. But also, I'm not highly deterministic in the way I understand politics. Politics is not simply institutions and interests and values. Politics are also the talent of political leaders. Politics is also luck. I was surprised after the Macron elections, how everybody was trying to say this was, for example, pro-European type of liberalism that won this and that. No, there was a guy. This guy has very specific characteristics, and it is him who won, not an ideological platform. And also, this guy was lucky like hell. So if you're going to get luck out of his victory, you're also not understanding enough. We have been, for different reasons, I do believe we stopped to think about the primacy of politics. A strange combination of institutionalism and kind of economism is trying to understand political as something that does not have a substance of its own. It has. It has a substance of its own. It's very much rooted in the economy, but there is a politics. And by the way, populists are very much about the primacy of the political in the way the Social Democrats were in the end of the 19th century. Yeah, Germany. Listen, what I have learned from the disintegration of Yugoslavia and Soviet Union is something which is, for me, very central. Major political projects do not disintegrate from the periphery. It's not the Baltics Republic that disintegrated Soviet Union. The Baltics have been kept for years. They can run away any moment when they're going to be allowed. Soviet Union disintegrated because the Russian federations decided that they're going to go for optimal union, probably with Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Belarus, and they didn't want to pay the bills for the Central Asian republics, which they didn't feel basically neither culturally nor politically connected. So this is always the revolt of the center. And from this point of view, Germany is a very interesting development, not simply because of the results and not so much about the alternative for Germany. It's because of the Free Democrats. because free democrats in Germany decided, in my view, by leaving the coalition talks with the chancellor, decided to position themselves as pro-business, pro-European, but the party of the German interest, which is not ready to go with the French, who are the party, for them Macron is the kind of a party of the French interest. And this is quite important because in my view this is a long-term positioning. Because basically they believed that this type of old style Europeanism of, for example, Christian Democrats, it's not only the Chancellor Merkel, but Schäuble, are old-fashioned. They're going to be a much more militant, aggressive type of a pro-European nationalism, and they could be the voice of this, because otherwise you cannot understand, because what they did was, in fact, they created a crisis in the way the Germans understand their political stability and others and so on. And so from this point of view, yes, I do believe that could be a problem in the center. This is not clear how much and Macron is going to achieve. I do believe he's doing a lot, and I do believe he's politically talented, but France is not an easy country. From this point of view, then you have the Italy, and here is an important thing about Italy. There is a major difference between five-star movement and many of the other populist parties that you talk about. And this is that more in any other party in Europe, five-star movement has integrated direct democracy in the way they take decisions. So the supporters of the party vote on their computers, and this is what the MPs should vote for. This is a totally different animal. This is not about ideology. It's not about leader. Their leader is not in the parliament. I mean, so from this point of view, yes, I do believe it can come from the center. It could be very different. I do believe at the same time that the resilience of the European democracy should not be underestimated. People always believe that the book is very pessimistic. I was surprised, probably because my understanding of pessimism is slightly more radical. But also, people believe that the very fact that you're questioning something already makes you a pessimist. And to be honest, I'm slightly these days scared by the optimism of some of the political leaders. I cannot stand this trivialization of the problems that Europe is facing. This is, by the way, very much part of my background, basically coming from a communist country. Socialism was a society that cannot talk problems. You never had the problems. In a certain way, you always had the solutions. And this type of being bright-sighted all the time probably marked all of us to the extent that when basically Mr. Juncker, as every bad news coming saying this is for the good of the European Union, I start to be slightly kind of uneasy. People should make a distinction between success and failure. If the distinction between success and failure is destroyed, then we have a problem. Does it mean that the European Union is doomed? No. And my reasons why I'm optimistic in my pessimism, hopeful pessimist, is the following. First, as a result of the crisis, European societies for the first time started really to be interested in each other. For the first time, you can have people discussing Hungarian politics or Greek economy on their kitchen tables, people who normally are even not discussing their own governments. People started to be interested in the different perspective of others. Even when they disagree, they're forced to understand that others come from different positions. But this is how political community starts with a different type of political negotiations. Secondly, particularly after Brexit, people who have been perceiving just going against the European Union as symbolic politics, they understand that this can happen. And when this happens, they're going to pay the price. I do believe it was the total confusion that followed Brexit. The fact that you have people who have been agitated Brexit, and when it happened, they said, but why? This shocked people. And from this point of view, this has a disciplining effect. You start to realize that it's not a game anymore. It's real.
But last question before I would open the floor. But would you say that the manifold crisis in Europe, also the rise of populism, which somehow stems also from the rage against elites, that this has led to some degree some sort of a self-criticism of liberal elites, or do we just basically think that we can go on like this, saying that it's all a matter of communication inefficiencies and so on, or do you see that there is some sort of a rethinking? I mean,
Yeah.
for instance, in the migration crisis, I mean, obviously liberal elites got it wrong in a way and did not address the problem properly. So do you see some sort of rethinking? You meet a lot of people touring through Europe, or
Yeah. No, listen, first of all, when I say criticism, it's a self-criticism. When I talk about liberal elites, I include myself, I don't exclude. So I do believe that there is a problem and there was a crisis with a particular elite. It's not only European phenomena. I'm going to give you some American figures which I found kind of stunning and very important. At the moment, only 30% of the voters of the Republican Party in the United States believes that university contributes to the good of society. In a very short time, I do believe you're going to have the American right declaring war on universities and European left declaring war on the church. The two institutions basically that have been the universalist institutions in a strange way. Why I'm saying this? Because the elites which had a crisis very much is the meritocratic elites. And I'm not going to define here because I have been writing quite a lot in the book, but the very idea of meritocracy comes from Michael Young, a British sociologist from the 1950s. But this is basically people who have their position of power based on competence and mainly based on education. For me, the question that I was very much interested was the following. Why people who are ready to give their last money to send their kids to go to a good university does not want to be governed by people who has graduated these universities? And this is not, in my view, a trivial question because it goes with three other issues. First, we see a diminishing returns on education. People graduate universities and they don't get what they expect on the level of the labor market and others. Even I'm not talking about the typical American phenomenon with the debt that they're getting. But before, the very fact that you go in the universities in a certain way, success. And now you're getting out and even getting PhD and so on, and you don't know. You're jobless, you cannot get it. This is a very important issue. Secondly, the financial crisis put very much in crisis the competence of these elites, particularly when it comes to economic policy. You remember the famous meeting of the British Queen with the leading British economist, and she said, why you didn't get it? And this is very important, why you didn't get it. If you're so smart and if you're so expert and so on, why you didn't see what is happening? So if before there was a kind of a mystical, particularly about the economist, this is a nice story, I cannot not tell it. I was complaining, like every political scientist, about how much power economists has this day. But I was complaining in front of a very wise lady who is the head of the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science. And I said, never ever in the world such one profession, intellectual profession, has so much power like the economists today. So she looked at me and said, you're wrong, Ivan. They were the astrologists. And she said, and do you know what? The reasons for which they have been so powerful were the same that the economists are. First, technically very skillful people. And secondly, they can make claims about the future with a kind of level of certainty that nobody does. And then she smiled and said, and to be honest, their predictions on the level of true or not true are not so different. But I'm saying this because you have this, and there are two other factors that I found important. I was very clearly watching in my own country why the trust in so kind of a well-educated people is eroding and eroding. And one of the reasons is that this type of meritocratic elites are very mobile elites. If you're a good professor, you can teach in Vienna, you can teach in Japan, you can teach anywhere. So in the moment of crisis, you have an exit. For many of the people, there is no exit. And they very much insist that in the moment of crisis, their elites stay with them. And from this point of view, 10 years ago, speaking a foreign language was very much in Bulgaria increasing your chances to be elected as member of parliament. This was perceived as advantage. Today, this is perceived as disadvantage. The idea is I'm not going to vote for somebody who, if there's going to be a problem, is going to run away to Brussels or some other places. I want them to stay. And this type of a loyalty versus exit in my view, is critically important why these elites, which, to be honest, really, it's a humble elite. Most of these people are coming from humble backgrounds, so it's not about privileged elites. Most of these people, at least for my Bulgarian understanding, are not very much corrupt, at least with some other elites that I know. It's not about this. It's about that people don't believe that they have any leverage over these people in the moment of crisis. And this is also the difference between the financial capital and, for example, the old landowners. When the crisis comes, the landowner cannot take the land to himself and go abroad. He should stay, he should fight, he should do something, or he should lose. Now, basically, you can cash and leave. And the easiest with which the elites can cash and leave makes them so suspicious for the voters. And this is why the populists come and said, listen, the elites are telling you that society is like school. You go there, the good guys are getting good grants and taking exams, bad guys are leaving. We're telling you society is like family. We're together, we own to each other, we should stay together. So from this point of view, I do believe this is this crisis. Are they learning or not learning? Listen, normally people believe that stupid elites are politicians and smart people are experts. Being part of the experts, I can tell you that in the moment of crisis, this is just the other way around. The politicians have a much better understanding where the population stays and what people are seeing and not seeing. This arrogance of the experts towards the politicians is one of the, in my view, words that you can see. While experts, even when they know very well their own profession and when they're very fair in what they're saying, they're very much trying to reduce the problem only to the way they're formulating it. For example, migration crisis is a great example of this. Some of the best economists are going to tell you, European labor market has a huge problems. We need a new labor. You need a younger people who is going to change the demography. We need a new skills. Everything that they say makes a lot of sense. But if on the basis of this expert decision in this current moment, you're going to say, I'm opening the borders, you're going to destroy your democracy. And from this point of view, yes, I do believe that there is a much more self-critical and self-articulations, but strangely enough, it's much more outspoken in the political class than in the expert community.
Well, thanks a lot. I would like, yeah, please, could you? There are microphones here.
Thank you very much, Mr. Krastev, for your insights. A lot of them, or most of them. I would be interested to hear your views about the role of the ECB or central banks, because I think there is an intertwining of the financial crisis from 2007 and the migration crisis. Just two words on this. Without ECB, the southern states of the European Union would have blown up. So what ECB does and has done is to slow the disintegration process. And what I think is what we are telling the majority feels very good and felt very good that the politicians didn't do anything because they couldn't do anything, because everyone knows politics is just doesn't has any supremacy more than the politics of the central banks. And with the migration crisis, the people saw all the politicians are really helpless. So we have seen it in short time, in 7-8 years, in two very problematic situations, that politics is overweighted. They say they are very powerful, but in reality, they can't help us. What's your view?
Thank you. I would suggest that we take two more questions.
Or let's, because otherwise I'm going to be unfair to people. I'll try to be very brief in answers, but better answer, because otherwise, listen, I do believe that the model of European Union was policy without politics in the center, and politics without policy on the national level, particularly when it comes to the macroeconomic decision. I very much agree with you on the effect of the central bank. But here's the story. We managed to constitutionalize certain type of a macroeconomic decision making, And this is why the political parties so easily went into identity politics. Because when you cannot disagree on economic issues, you start to disagree on cultural issues. Where we can see also a positive impact of having two crises. And for example, Italians know it very well. For the Italians, the refugee crisis was the way to soften the pressure of the central bank and the EU on economic issues without basically changing the rules. Technically, it means the following. Italian and the Greek government said, we want the spending that we're doing for the refugee crisis to be taken out of the budget deficit. I do believe it is smart, to be honest. I do believe it is smart because in the time of crisis, you need flexibility. So from this point of view, you have two crises that can hurt each other or that can help each other. And this is the positive scenario, because in a certain way, you should recapitalize Italy and Greece in one way or the other. This is going to be very much up to Germany to decide on this, because if you're going to decide on this, then you're basically changing with 2-3% the nature of the economy and the growth and so on. So paradoxically, having more crisis allows you to balance and rebalance. In the same way, the Ukrainian crisis, basically the Russian annexation of Crimea and so on, put the problem of the defense spendings in a totally different way. In the absence of this crisis, the talk about a common defense and security policy is going to be just a talk. There is no public for this. Now, this is not just a talk. And there are countries, because this is the story with, I do believe, what Macron wants. He said, consolidation of the euro and basically common, much more redistribution in the eurozone for the West and much more security guarantees for the East. Saying to the Poles, listen, we are ready to buy your anti-Russian policy if you are basically going to stay away from reconsolidation of the European center. Probably I'm misreading him, but it's...
Maybe the next question.
Thank you very much. I heard with great interest what you had to say to the present European crisis. But what will happen if migration will not stop? You know that Branko Milanovic, only recently he published it in the Le Monde International in October, but you can also read it on his blogs and everywhere. So he is one of the main experts on inequality, that migration will not stop. It will continue, and of course Europe or the European countries have to find an answer to that. And in addition, he said the rise of new middle classes outside Europe, in China, India, Brazil, will lead to even more inequality in European countries. And do you think that the two papers which Juncker published this year, in March, his 5 scenarios for the EU, and I think it was in September, his vision of enlargement, do offer any kind of solution? I don't think so, because I think at the root, at the root of our problems, it's not, of course not the only reason, is nevertheless also neoliberal politics which are dominating Brussels.
I do believe that Mr. Juncker is not giving an answer, but to be honest, it's very difficult from where he is to do it. I am not blaming him for this. Because don't forget, the 5 scenarios are everything that could happen. Any moment he's going to come with his preference, he's going to be attacked that he represents a special interest. So from this point of view, when we're critical to certain positions, it's fair to know also the constraints under which they function. What he's saying is, yeah, we can choose between this and that and so on. And I do believe, of course, Branko Milanovic is absolutely right. I'm even going to give you 2 more things on the level of the data that we know that is going to make the migration crisis much more difficult problem than it looks like. Now people who said we should close totally the border said we're going to compensate and we're going to do our moral obligations by giving money to the third world countries, and when we're going to give money to the developing countries, they're not going to emigrate. So this is not what the literature says. Basically, The Economist has demonstrated it, that people from the poorest countries are not the ones that immigrate. People start to immigrate when slightly, basically, their position improves, because then they have much more resources to move and capacity and so on. So paradoxically, if we're successful helping some of the poorest countries, we're going to increase the pressure for immigration, not to decrease it. Secondly, some people said, we are going basically to get certain amount of migrants, and then we can stop. The other thing that comes from literature, Paul Collier has a lot of studies on this, showing is one of the major factors that determines where people decide to emigrate is, are they people from their community there? So from this point of view, paradoxically, the more migrants you have, the more migrants you get. So this is a story, and this is important to have this data, because people should not be treated like, don't tell them things that sounds dangerous. Because I agree on one thing, you cannot simply close the borders. This walls up psychological devices. You're doing for population, but you're buying time. And from this point of view, there are issues which you are solving by basically buying time and allowing to people to adjust to the fact that the world has changed dramatically. That they're going to be movement. Let's give you a Polish example. Paul said that we cannot live with one refugee. At the same time, do you know how many are the labor migrants from Ukraine in Poland today? Half, at least. Yeah, it depends whom you ask. But here is going to come. But here's going to come something very important, and this is going to have a moral implication for Europe, and it's going to be very difficult. In my book, I said I'm not going to make a distinctions between refugees and migrants, not because I don't know the distinction, because in the public imagination that I was trying to discuss, this type of a border has been very much blurred. But secondly, because with the coming of time, the border is going to be even more difficult to keep. Imagine that climate change refugees. Are they refugees? Are they migrants? And here's the story. We claim that we are ready to receive refugees because it's a moral obligations, but we insist basically that we should have our decision rightly to take migrants or not. The truth is that we want migrants, we don't want refugees. Because migrants, you're selective. You can decide whom you want. You can basically really compensate for this and that. Refugees, anybody that comes. And I do believe that one story is that the biggest movement of people is going to be from the refugee category to the migration category. And this is why and this is going to be not an easy political issue, particularly keeping in mind that now when refugee is an individual case, don't forget this, what the Chancellor did, and this was very different, is she said, everybody coming from Syria, I'm ready to treat as a refugee. But if you go according to the rules, you're deciding in every individual case who is a refugee and who is a migrant. And this is going to be the biggest political rewriting that we're going to see these days. Because also, honestly speaking, with the migrant, you're legally and politically much more free to do what you want and so on and so on. So the problem is also where these people come from. It's not about the numbers. This is going to be about very much integration, but it is also going to be very much how our societies are going to react. I'm always giving the example in Bulgaria in the 1920s, after the Balkan Wars and World War I, the number of the refugees was like in Lebanon now, 1/3 of the population. And people managed to integrate it, but here's the paradox. The more you have a welfare state, the more difficult to integrate. Nevertheless, that the welfare state is a very rich one, but all the integration should go through the state. Why 3.5 million in Turkey have been kind of digested much easier? Because the integration goes through a kind of a labor market, official or unofficial, and through families and social networks. Here, basically, when you go on the state, when you get to somebody, the biggest question is from whom you are getting something. And I do believe that this is going to affect very much, if you want, with the integration. And this is a European problem. If you're going to talk about the future of migration, you're talking about the future of the welfare state. And you're talking about the future of the welfare state in aging societies. And this is, and just to make the situation slightly more interesting before going to the next question, now we talk only about the demographic panics that come with migration. In 10 years, I can promise you we're going to have a panic coming from the technological revolution, when with the automation of jobs and others, and this time it's going to touch on other people, particularly middle class and white collar workers. How we're going to respond to this? Even now I was trying to commission Gallup International to make a global survey whom you prefer to work with, a robot or foreigner from different culture. Who do you prefer to take care of you when you're aging? A robot or somebody from other culture? And believe me, I'm sure that the countries are going very much to differentiate I can bet that Japanese will go for robots.
Yes, but I also find it interesting that this could be the next big challenge,
Yeah.
Digitalization and robot economics. But in the end, couldn't it be an advantage for society to have a shrinking population in a scenario like this? That it's more easier for society where demography is going down to adapt to processes like that?
No, listen. From this, I'm very humble on this because I don't know about you. I really cannot imagine how society is going to look in 20 years. Normally, we perceive society as the projection for certain trends that we see now. But I do believe we're at a turning point in which, for example, what was the difference between the rich people and the poor people, for example, at the end of the 19th century? Rich people had leisure. They had free time. They can paint, they can read, they can walk around, and basically the poor people have been working all the time. What is becoming the difference between the rich people and kind of the poor people these days? Rich people are working all the time. And we're basically asking the poor people to start to be interested in painting and walking and things like this, because the basic income idea is about this. So, but listen, but this is a radical change. You ask me to, so this is why, I don't know, I do believe it's going to be different. I don't know how different.
Well, thanks a lot. Maybe we take one more question or two more. Yeah, the gentleman in the third row, and then you. Me first? No, the gentleman in the third row, please. Thank you. And you, if it's all right.
Yes, I think the big problem within the EU is the representation of the voters. And this is, as you said, it's the feeling of losing control. First, they thought Juncker and his colleagues or his colleagues will manage it. Then they saw he's losing control. No border control outside, no border control inside is losing control. And now they are seeing that the people, the voters, don't have any control over the EU. They see the Prime Minister once a month in Brussels and so on, and they know what's the parliament. And they have the feeling they have no control, they have no power, and that's true. So I think the real problem for the EU, if the aim is a EU like Juncker wants it, is the representation of the voters, and nobody talks about it. It's probably because it's the most complicated item whatsoever, more complicated than the economic one.
No, I totally agree, but listen, is this not the paradox of the modern society? That we are freer than before? Because we should face it. I mean, we are freer on making choices and others, but this is at the expense of our voters' power. And here is the story, because we're talking about representation. How representation is going to look in a society which is very much governed by big data, where basically you don't think very much in terms of simply a voter, where the power of the elites to manipulate voters has been also very much increased. For example, the next European elections, in my view, and I'll be very brief on this, is going to be one of the crisis points in which we're going to know certain things about the future of the Union, and I'm just going to give you a very simple political science prediction why. We know from the previous European elections that Eurosceptic political parties try to be overrepresented on the European elections, because European elections has a lower turnout, and the people who go to vote, a big number of them are people who are very critical to the Union. Okay, make a coefficient out of how much they overrepresented, and then take the current level of support for some of these parties, and then put the coefficient there. And you're going to end up with the European Parliament, which is dominated by Eurosceptical parties. We always started with the idea that European institutions, as a rule, are totally pro-European and so on and so on. It does not need to be the case. And from this point of view, the European elections could be a very important issue to be discussed. But I agree very much with you. Democracy in the way we know it, based on a representation and so on, obviously is neither going to work on the level of the European Union nor in the way the society has been changing. Because also one of the things that is changing very much is that our idea of identity, we want to choose everything for ourselves. There was one American data that made me totally kind of fascinated. Do you know the percent of the Americans who are changing their confession in their lifetime? 40%. 40%. Tell me something which is more stable and conservative than your religious belonging. So people don't want anymore to live with anything that they have inherited by somebody else. I really imagine the moment in which kids are going to start to basically choose their parents. But this is very much change, because part of the identity politics is about this. We're living in a totally different world, and our democracies are not prepared for this type of a choice and individual. So there are going to be institutional changes. Yeah.
It was a wonderful evening, thank you. Ivan, as I was walking here, I had that adage, a fish always rots from the head. And I've never watched a fish rot, so I don't know if it's true, but you seem to think that fish does rot from the head. But having said that, given what's going on in the periphery, which is Hungary, Poland to a degree, what does all this mess mean for our friends in the Balkans who actually want to join this wonderful European integration project?
Yeah. No, listen, this is a great example, because what is happening can be a good news and bad news for the Balkans. Why it can be a good news? Because European Union in the way it was now was not going to enlarge anymore. This type of European Union was not going to enlarge, because you have the fears and so on. If you're going to have a kind of a two-speed European Unions and others, and exactly because the borders, the external borders of the European Union are coming, if they're going to be core and periphery, Balkans are going to be in the way where Bulgarians are, Romanians are, Poles, Hungarians, others. So on the other side, one of the things that is happening more and more, and I do believe when we talk about the impact of emigration, Balkan societies are the greatest example of this. And as some people probably, because I have been giving talks here, I'm a great fan of Hirschman's Exit, Voice and Loyalty. And I do believe that one thing that has changed very much in politics is when Hirschman was making this, because this last answer, he was making a very simple point. He said, what is the difference between the behavior of the people on the field of economy and on the field of politics? He said, on the market, when you don't like something, you don't try to change it. You go for another product. I don't like this beer because it deteriorated its quality. I'm not going to write them letters to start to do it better. I'm going to buy another beer. But he said there are things that you're not changing so easily in life. And this is your country, your religion, your party, your family. And then you try to change. If the first time the response is exit, he hit his voice. You're trying to improve. For him, loyalty was taken for granted. For him, politics was based on loyalty. But when 40% of the population can change their religious identity in their lifetime, I do believe that people start to behave very much on the political field in the way they're behaving on economic field. They exit. And this is why migration, what I wrote in the book to make it more PR friendly, is probably the revolution of the 21st century. Exactly because in individual terms, getting out is giving you the promise for much kind of a radical change than trying to change the system. How democracies are going to change with this, I don't know. But because Robert is coming from Canada, listen, only Canadians care about the Balkans these days. Thank you very much.
Thank you for this wonderful evening. So if you want to dive deeper into Ivan's world, just buy his book, be it in English or German.
We'll talk to you.